Good evening. I'm Jeanette Gabriel, the director of the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at the University of Nebraska-Omaha. And I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to our author talk on writing and nuance featuring Ilana Masad. This author talk is part of a summer author series with Ilana Masad that is sponsored by the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at UNO and the Jewish Federation of Omaha. After tonight's talk, a group of young emerging writers will engage in a week-long fiction workshop with Ilana Masad. The participants will generate new fiction through a series of prompts, writing exercises, and in-class discussion, and work on their own writing skills, generating at least one complete piece of flash fiction by the end of the class. This will be followed by a public event that we encourage you to join us for, the Emerging Fiction Writers Open Mic Night, that will be Monday, June 14th from 8 to 9 p.m. The co-sponsors for the workshop include the UNO English Department, UNO Women's and Gender Studies, and UNO's Writers Workshop. We're very pleased to introduce this new collaborative model that we hope will create friendships and relationships between graduate, undergraduate, high school students, and young community members who will have an opportunity to get to know each other and work together.
um, Dr. Tracy Bridgeford and UNO's English Department, Karen Falconer Al-Hindi and UNO's Women's and Gender Studies Department, and Miles Wagner, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and UNO's Writers Workshop. I'll start by just reading a few pages from my novel, which just came out in paperback. Very briefly, the novel is about a queer woman named Maggie, whose mom, Iris, dies very suddenly, leaving behind, among other things, 5 letters to 5 men that Maggie has never heard of. Over the course of the novel, Maggie takes a road trip to hand deliver the letters to these men. And the novel also includes several chapters from Iris's point of view, and this is one of them, and is about her and her first husband, Shlomo. Iris, April 2nd, 1977. Years later, Iris would remember the first time Shlomo hurt her being April Fool's Day, 1977. But it wasn't. It was the day after, and there was absolutely nothing funny about it. That day, Iris walked to the synagogue office to join Shlomo with paperwork. They had written a letter of introduction that they were going to send to the congregation, which wasn't too pleased about the coming transition. They'd known the old rabbi for years, a white-haired, long-bearded man whom Iris secretly compared to the man on the Bridge of Death in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. She didn't tell Shlomo this, since he didn't usually find her humor very amusing. She discovered after they'd gotten married that he was much more serious than she'd thought. But Iris was ready to be serious. She'd gotten up late to find Shlomo already gone. He'd let her sleep in, a peace offering perhaps, after they'd argued over something inane the night before. In the bathroom, she was disappointed to see red on the toilet paper after she wiped. They'd been half-heartedly trying to get pregnant. Iris had stopped taking her birth control right after the wedding because early in their courtship, she and Shlomo had discussed how much they were both looking forward to raising children. This was one thing they agreed on wholeheartedly. But as for trying, well, Iris had to admit that sex wasn't all it was cracked up to be, or at least she hadn't found it to be so yet. She'd been a virgin when they married, more because there hadn't been anyone else whose intellect she respected enough to be attracted to before. She'd gone out with some boys in Brighton Beach, boys whose families went to the same shul she and her parents attended during the high holidays, boys who went to the same Jewish camp in the summer as she did. But she'd known most of them since they were all in diapers, and the boys she'd met who weren't Jewish made her uncomfortable because she couldn't imagine bringing them home to her parents. They weren't religious, really, but they both clung to certain aspects of their upbringing. More than that, they'd made it clear to her that after what they'd seen and gone through in the war, they didn't trust goys and never would. They never talked about what happened in detail, but over the years, Iris had heard stories from friends and their relatives. But it wasn't the stories that made her parents' reality settle in her mind. The thing that haunted her memory all the way to her marriage was discovering the shoebox under their bed. It was a Saturday, and her mother had gone out to offer some of her goulash to old Mrs. Wenceslas, who lived next door and was ill. Iris and her father were playing hide and seek in the small apartment, and while he counted loudly to 100 in their narrow living room, she went to wriggle under her parents' bed, a bold move, since she wasn't usually allowed in there. But her mother had left the door open on her way out, and that was enough of an invitation for Iris. While she waited for her father's slow search to begin, "Is she under the table?" he would ask in his hard-won, accented English, and pull the tablecloth up with a flourish, and then sigh dramatically and say, "No, she is not. Where is she?" While she was under there, she discovered the box. Inside, she found several rubber-banded together rolls of cash, maybe for emergencies, a faded red ribbon, and a photograph that was so battered and old that she couldn't make out the details of the faces. But she could tell it was a family, 2 tall people and 2 little ones, parents, children. When her father walked in and discovered her under the bed with the box open and her hand in front of her clutching the picture, he became very still. He told her to put the photo back and come out. She was scared, since her mother always said her father would whip her if she did something bad, though he had never laid a finger on her. But the threat was there, and the possibility that he was just holding back for something bad enough. "Come," he said, and sat her on his knee in the living room like he had when she was very little. He patted her back a couple of times, and she waited, twisting the silver ring with a little blue stone she got from a cereal box around and around on her finger. The ring had made the skin under it green days ago already, but she refused to take it off. It made her feel powerful, and she pretended it had magic powers and could zap whoever she wanted. If her father tried to whip her, she could kazam the belt right out of his hand. But it turned out she didn't need to. Instead of punishing her, her father explained to her quietly that her mother had lost everything in the war. Everything. A husband and 2 young children. Iris had already known that her mama was much older than many of the other women who bore the same title. Now she understood why. For many years after the war, her father said her mother hadn't wanted to have other children. She didn't trust in peacetime or safety. But she got pregnant despite their best efforts. And Iris didn't understand until she was older that this meant that she herself was an accident. Much, much later, when she would get pregnant with Ariel, part of the reason she decided to have him despite her age and the possible risks to her health was that her own mother had kept her. She felt she owed it to the universe, to the God she wasn't certain of. After Iris's father told her what his wife had lost and why, Iris became more suspicious of the world around her. It seemed capable of evil, dangerous, in a way she hadn't quite understood before. And when it came to dating, she simply couldn't handle all the goyish brown-haired and blonde boys with blue eyes that some of her friends went gaga for. She'd look at them with the understanding that there was only a thin veil between their kindly behavior and the ability to follow orders. And so when she'd met Shlomo, she saw an appealingly haughty Jew who was secure in his faith and his place in the world, a third-generation American, the rebel son of Haredi Jews in Flatbush who saw the reform movement breach his community's neighborhoods and decided he liked their approach. He wanted to make Judaism more accessible, not less. So he left his parents and siblings and community behind and turned to what he perceived as the intellectually superior, not to mention modern, Reform Judaism, and lived with the conviction that he was doing the right thing, the honorable thing in the eyes of God. Iris fell for him and his conviction. Both of them were working at the Jewish camp Iris had once attended. She as a girls' counselor and he as a boys'. They were also both in school, though he was older, studying to become a rabbi at Yeshiva University, where she was getting a degree in education at Hunter College, what people called the Jewish girls' Radcliffe, at her parents' insistence. She had no idea what she wanted to do, but they believed teaching was both a noble profession and always in demand. She and Shlomo had gotten along splendidly, mostly because she thought he was one of the smartest men she'd ever met, able to tell her for hours about the various texts, philosophies, prophets, and scholars of yore, while also expounding on music and movies and theater, much of which he was severely critical of. It would be years before she understood that memorization and specialized knowledge didn't automatically equal great intelligence, though she continued to be attracted to obsessives of one kind or another. And I will leave it there. So thank you again, and good evening. Let me be honest with you up front. I don't seem nervous. Oh, sorry, I skipped a bit. Already doing things a bit wrong. All right. So, as I was about to say, I am very anxious about giving you this talk today for multiple reasons. What if I let down the people who invited me here? What if I disappoint all of you here in the audience today? What if I talk about where I grew up, about Israel and Palestine, in a way that alienates or offends you? I've been told in the past that I don't seem nervous when speaking or reading to an audience. I have a former version of myself to thank for that. You see, before I discovered that I wanted to be a writer, I spent most of my childhood and youth wanting to be an actor. When I declared this ambition around the age of 7, my father, Zichrono Livracha, who, before meeting my mother, had dated an actor in London for some time, gravely explained to me how difficult the life of an actor could be. Audition after audition, rejection after rejection, needing to work other jobs while chasing the dream of being an artist full time. In my memory, I cheerfully and precociously told him, "That's okay, I'll waitress." That's how much I wanted it. So I took a lot of acting classes and I went to junior high at an arts high school in Tel Aviv, and I auditioned for the same school's prestigious drama program. I was rejected. I mourned that for a few years, and in the process started writing poetry, as so many teenagers do, and finally discovered that prose was where I felt most at home. In college, I got back into acting just for fun and learned more about what kind of performance suits me. It's that aspiring actor version of myself that is responsible for my outward calm today. I learned how to perform past my anxiety, but it's still there, coiled and ready like a python lying in wait. It won't bite me, that's not really its style, but it will wrap around my neck and chest and squeeze, and it'll whisper in my ear about all the ways I might have screwed up this evening, all the ways I may have offended or hurt or annoyed or inconvenienced someone. Right now, for instance, it's telling me that I'm oversharing, that I'm already making you uncomfortable. But there's a reason I'm telling you all this. I want to demonstrate how two contradictory truths can exist side by side. Internally, I am very nervous and anxious right now. Externally, if everything goes as planned, I appear confident and comfortable. These truths coexist in my body. Now I'm going to tell you a story because I am a storyteller and that is what I do. These stories are as truthful as I can make them, but there are probably things that I misremember, and there might be narratives that have been embellished and passed on to me. After all, I received parts of this story piecemeal from my grandparents and my father, with my mother and brother filling in gaps I hadn't heard. That is why I like the word story better than the word truth. Truth is a word that implies rigidity, even though it is anything but rigid. The word truth, as noun and adjective, has 13 definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary, and a bunch of sub-definitions under each of those. The first of those definitions is loyalty, faithfulness, etc. It isn't until the fifth definition that we get something that conforms with fact or reality. Truth, then, is a tricky thing, especially in a time of mass media misinformation, where facts on the ground are reshaped and packaged into dangerous realities or narratives that maintain power structures that keep us from connecting, uniting, and thriving. Truth is also a word that seems to rely on logic, on facts. But every fact needs a story, or else it is a dangling piece of data without context, without meaning. Stories allow for narrative arcs and meaning making, allow for nuances and contradictions and shades of gray. So here is one such story. On the morning of Valentine's Day in 2018, I read the following headline on the Chicago Tribune website. Experts debunk study that found Holocaust trauma is inherited. It was referring to a now infamous study by Dr. Rachel Yehuda that attempted to prove a genetic change caused by trauma that may be passed along to offspring. My eyes welled up. Every nerve in me wanted to hurt, to scream, but I wouldn't knowingly or purposefully do harm to anyone other than myself. The skin of my stomach still bore the faint scars of former outbursts of frustration. I bit my nails and tried to calm the roiling anger inside me, a powerful rage born of not being able to understand, to pin down why I was the way I was, why I am still the way I am, anxious, depressed, racked with guilt, and why I felt then and now the way I do, deeply responsible for the well-being of others, guilty when I focus on myself, torn between my own survival and the collective good. I emailed my therapist the article with the subject line, ... debunked. I meant it to be passive aggressive, but really I was crushed, and she knew it. I'd thought I'd found an answer, an explanation, only to feel invalidated yet again. She sent me a link to a book, Granddaughters of the Holocaust, Never Forgetting What They Didn't Experience. I recoiled at the title. How ridiculous, how self-indulgent. I told her that I was disappointed that Dr. Yehuda's methods and conclusion had been called into question. I told her, it's hard for me to swallow it being just a narrative-based thing. It being the trauma experienced by the granddaughters in that book's title. It being my own relationship to trauma. This is what she wrote back 2 days later. I'd say just a narrative-based thing would be a false oppositeness. In our next session, she elaborated. Trauma has been scientifically found to have adverse effects on our biology, a fact accepted by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Whether that trauma is genetically passed along or not, the narrative of trauma often is, though through the actions of a family member or through the stories they tell. We inherit so many things from our families that aren't provably genetic. The way we move our arms when we talk. You can't see it, but I'm doing a lot of arm moving right now. The noises of satisfaction we make while eating a favorite food. The rhythms of our speech. My therapist asked why I distrusted the narrative of the granddaughters in that book. After all, one of the things I most struggled with is how I couldn't point to a particular, graspable, tangible incident that would cause me to feel the kind of guilt I experienced, that underlay everything I did and still do. As a writer, especially, my therapist pointed out, shouldn't I accept that narratives serve as evidence of our experience? Haven't I spent hours and hours writing out versions of my own narrative, as well as imbuing fictional narratives with emotional truths? Why, as a writer, she wondered, was I so suspicious of my own narratives? Here is the narrative I knew. My paternal grandparents, my Saba Tzvi and Savta Helen, separately and unaware of each other, both fled Poland during the early days of what would become World War II. Tzvi's mother essentially kicked him out of the house and told him to run, run far, and run alone. His siblings were all married with children, and as the only single and untethered person in the family, he had the best chance of survival. He crossed the Russian border, and it was when he made the decision to turn back that he was caught. I imagine he was lonely and terrified, that he missed his family and was worried about them. Perhaps he felt like a coward for running. Maybe he was already experiencing a dreadful guilt, which must have become so much worse when he survived the war while the rest of his family were exterminated. Savta Helen also ran with her mother and older sister. Tzvi was in his late teens, as far as I can tell. Helen was in her early 20s, though she lied about her age later to make it less scandalous when she married a younger man. Even after her death, we never found out when exactly she was born. Both Tzvi and Helen and her family, having come from Poland, now German-occupied, were accused of being German spies, a terrible irony, and placed in labor camps in Siberia. Both of them worked as tree cutters there for years, with no shoes, little clothing, and very little food in that impossible, impenetrable cold. Once, when Helen was in the Russian labor camps, her crew was given meat, which hardly ever happened. A friend of hers, having so enjoyed the rare bounty, asked one of the Soviet soldiers who watched over them what kind of meat it was. He told her, deadpan, one of the horses died. When she caught his meaning, Helen's friend threw up her meager meal. Stupid, Helen told her. Food is food. Helen and Zvi both survived under conditions that were as bad as those in many Nazi camps. When the Third Reich fell and the war ended, they were sent to Samarkand in what is today Uzbekistan. There, a Jewish matchmaker hitched them. They married because that's what you did when you were an Orthodox Jew, which they both were, though Helen, despite being the daughter of a rabbi, lost all her faith in God during her ordeal and only went along with religious traditions and strictures for her new husband's sake. After they married, Helen and Zvi were sent to a displaced persons camp in Ulm in Germany, which was where my father was born and where Helen's health problems started. She was found to have osteomyelitis, a bone infection, and it went untreated due to a severe shortage of penicillin in the DP camp. A nurse, according to family legend, it was Albert Einstein's niece, apparently took a shine to my infant father and helped care for him and managed to get some penicillin for Helen, but it was too late. Eventually, after surgeries in both Germany and later in Israel, Helen ended up with one leg shorter than the other, forever needing to use canes and wear specially cobbled shoes to make up for the difference. In the newly created Israel, a blatantly purposeful Jewish state meant to house the survivors, refugees that very few countries wanted to take in, there was new stigma. The very souls whose trauma and survival caused the UN to affirm Israel's statehood, alongside an independent Palestinian nation that has yet to be founded, were in the fledgling Israel viewed with suspicion. The Sabras, those Jews who knew no other land because their parents or grandparents had settled in Palestine, and those Jews who fled Europe for Palestine before the war began, they couldn't understand the traumatized new arrivals. Why didn't the Jews of Europe fight the Nazis harder? How had they let themselves be exterminated? And how dare they complain now that they arrived in this ethno-state they'd done nothing to help establish? Survivor's guilt set in for many, and it took years before the Holocaust was openly discussed. It seemed to be somehow shameful to have survived it. The immigrant experience wasn't made easier by a lack of jobs and infrastructure, as well as a lack of family support for those, my grandparents included, whose extended clans had perished. Helen was ill much of the time and developed an addiction to painkillers after her surgeries. She couldn't work. Zvi took on back-to-back shifts as a typesetter and later proofreader for Haaretz, one of the oldest Hebrew language newspapers. Helen's sister, who had one daughter herself, refused to take my father in as a 2-year-old toddler. She claimed her resources were tapped out. Helen never forgave her for this. My father spent his earliest years in and out of children's homes that housed orphans and those children whose parents couldn't care for them. As if that weren't enough, members of Helen and Zvi's community and the distant relatives they found spoke to my father as if he were to blame for his mother's illness, for the fact that she was now disabled. It wasn't the labor camps that broke her body, after all. It was my father being born. It wasn't an accident of fate and bacteria and an imperfect hospital in post-war conditions. It was my father's existence as a newborn. For years, he was made to feel guilty for being. He claimed that he learned from this experience that guilt was a useless emotion, that it didn't solve or change anything, and that he subsequently refused to feel it. For a very long time, long after his death, I believed him, and I felt guilty for my own guilt, until I realized that his refusal to acknowledge the feeling must have been his response to having so much of it. Where he covered his pit of guilt with a sturdy manhole cover, I jumped down it and discovered the My father was a classic second-generation Holocaust survivor. He ate everything on his plate. If bread was going bad, he'd scrape off the mold and eat the rest. If he didn't like his food, well, he ate it anyway. He kept things, small and useful things, like spare string, tools even after they'd begun rusting, paper clips and twist ties, every kind of tape you could think of, from duct tape to electrical to masking. Shoelaces, any and all spare change, coat hangers, and plastic bags. He wasn't a hoarder exactly, because he kept these collections organized, neat, and contained. He wasn't a survivalist because he didn't stockpile excessively or obsess about an apocalypse. No, he was simply prepared for every eventuality, for every meal to possibly be his last. He didn't make my brother and me lick our plates clean, and he didn't make us save stuff. He understood his neuroses and didn't want to inflict them on us. But I find myself keeping little piles of extra twist ties, which prove useful as impromptu cat toys. I don't throw out food at home unless it is revolting. I drink milk until it's clearly gone bad, and at restaurants, I can't not finish my meal because I know they will throw out the food if I don't. Of course, I inherited all sorts of other things from my father. His chin, his on-point eyebrow game, his ability and desire to drink coffee when it's hot, 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 palms as able as his to hold those hot, hot, hot mugs without flinching. Also, his thirst for justice, his disgust with the actions of successive Israeli governments, with a place that was supposed to be a refuge, which became long ago, nearly with its very inception, a place where one traumatized people enacted horrors onto another population. Palestinians, a people who had lived under the thumb of one colonial power for years and another before that, a people who are suffering and have been suffering for generations. I know that many American Jews are taught that Israel is a safe haven, a place Jews could run to if they needed. But I grew up there, and I can tell you that the way that it is, that is not a safe haven, and certainly not the kind that we deserve. Safety that is earned only by making certain other people suffer, the way a bullied child becomes a bully herself to avoid being hurt, is no safety at all. For in the process, those enacting harm are harming themselves as well, tainting themselves with an ugliness that might live in them forever and pass on to their children, unless they are willing to sit with it and reckon with it. There is nuance here too, of course. When I think of Israel, I don't first and only think occupier or apartheid. I also think home. I think of my friends, of school, of my childhood. I think of the place where I first began writing, where I attended my first poetry readings in Tel Aviv, where I was a minor groupie for a rock band called Black Widow when I was 16 and fleeing my grief, where I watched my friends join the IDF while I did not, where the last time I visited, I entered the Mediterranean and started crying because of how much I love it, how much I love the buoyancy and warmth of that incredible body of water that my father swam in every Saturday for most of my childhood. I think of my father who is buried there. He died when I was 16 after 8 months of treatment for lung cancer. Yes, he was a smoker. That's the question everyone asks, as if the fact that he had vices, like everyone does, meant he deserved to die. He started smoking when he was 13, but really he started earlier, when he was about 9, when his disabled, traumatized mother started asking him to light her cigarettes for her in his own mouth. I don't know why she asked him to do this. I don't know why he agreed. He was an only child, though, and had to be a partial caretaker for his disabled mother. Does that make the harm she enacted by asking him to do this okay? No, it does not. But does understanding her own story help me understand her? Yes. Yes, it does. Understanding the nuances of hurt and harm, the ways in which hurt people, can be a painful set of contradictions to carry around without expressing them. That is one of the reasons why I write. When my father was in the hospital, some of his nurses had accents that clued me into the fact that Arabic was their first language. The irony of this, by the way, is that plenty of Mizrahi Jews, as well as older generations of Ashkenazi Jews in British-occupied Palestine, spoke in similar accents, the Ain vowel coming from deep in their throats. At the time, I didn't think about the politics of it. These Palestinian nurses caring for my father with more kindness than any of his breast doctors. The doctors would just come in to tell us he was dying some more, while the nurses were the ones who cared about making him comfortable, making him laugh, treating him like a human being rather than a puzzle box to be solved or abandoned. Now, though, I think about them with all the political nuance of a grown-up. What had their family suffered during the Nakba, that terrorizing set of events enacted by Jews in the name of a Jewish ethno-state? What stigmas did they suffer on a daily basis? Did other patients and their families treat them with suspicion? What did they tell their children about being second-class citizens in a nation proclaiming democracy and freedom? James Baldwin, whose writing I find so beautiful I can barely stand it sometimes, wrote in Notes of a Native Son, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense, once hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with pain. I think about this all the time. I think too about his letter to his nephew in The Fire Next Time, how he wrote this about white Americans. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years, and for innumerable reasons, that Black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. I put myself in a very minor kind of danger by talking to you about all of this today, but I am committed to understanding my history. As an Israeli, I learned so little of Jewish history because history classes at school were intent on teaching us Israeli history, while of course sugarcoating the atrocities right out of the curriculum. I didn't learn much about American history until I moved to the US and worked on my own to do so and to understand my position in this country. I learn more and more about Jewish history every year and find myself more and more in love with our resilience, our adaptability, and our storytelling. Every one of our holidays includes a story, or many. There's something awe-inspiring to me about being part of a group who, for a couple millennia and more, have managed to keep alive and adapt a variety of traditions and rituals and stories, even as various populations have kept trying to literally kill us. It's humbling. At the same time, I'm sickened by how governments and government bodies vying for power are warping our survival, turning it into an excuse to oppress others. Here is another narrative. I am a white person in these here United States. I had a pretty good childhood and I was raised in a mostly secure middle-class household. I pass for straight if I need to. I am in good enough health, my vitals within normal range. I have maintained good relationships for much of my life. I'm close to the family I have left. I'm in a PhD program. I'm doing well. I'm fine. Really. Here's another narrative. I was uprooted at age 3 from my home in Los Angeles and moved across oceans to Israel. I was bullied in elementary school and ostracized and made fun of for my bilingualism and my bookishness. My Saba Tzvi died, and then my maternal grandmother Rana was ill and died, then my maternal grandfather Jerry, then my father Uri, then my Savta Helen, all before I turned 17. I developed an eating disorder. I recovered. I went to college. I relapsed. I left college. I recovered, sort of. I have arthritis in my lower back. My hands ache more often than not. I have shooting pains throughout my entire body at inopportune and mysterious times. My fatigue is becoming rather untenable. I've had migraines since I was 6, possibly earlier. I've had a constant shifting headache every single day of my life that I can remember. I only recently received a satisfactory diagnosis after years of doctors dismissing me. A rare genetic disorder, that affects my connective tissue, the stuff that literally holds my bones and muscles together. If indeed I suffer from intergenerational trauma, then it's clear where this guilt comes from. My grandparents, guilty for surviving oft unsurvivable ordeals. My father, guilty for being born and harming his mother in the process. Guilty for later shucking off the religion and God he was raised with and choosing a different path. I feel guilty for entertaining this possibility in the first place and struggle with its possible reality. How dare I think, complain about my own life, let alone take on the burdens of traumas I never experienced firsthand. And on the other hand, my body aches due to a rare genetic disorder. My depression continues to overcome every drug thrown at it. I go through life both wishing to be seen and simultaneously treading as lightly as possible so as never to step on anyone's toes. In one of my only memories of my Sabatzvi, who died when I was 4, he is teaching me how to draw a pearl necklace. The human shape on the page is very basic, a few lines to denote a face with shirt and buttons. There is barely any neck, but along it my Saba draws little circles to signify pearls. Most actual pearls are formed inside oysters and are the result of an irritant. When an irritant invades the oyster's body, its response is to produce a protective coating composed of calcium carbonate, a substance mainly found in rocks. One layer of this substance after another is shed by the oyster, and over time, the concentric layers become a pearl. Pearls are considered precious, but only when they hold a perfect spherical form. But there are other kinds called Baroque pearls whose shapes are not so neat. I find them more beautiful for their imperfections and wonder what it is about that perfect circle that we find so precious. A couple of years ago, my brother gave my sister-in-law the pale pink pearl necklace made of those perfect orbs that belonged to my Savta, who got them from Tzvi for an anniversary present. Maybe that's why he taught me how to draw them. One of the first memories I have of my Savta is oddly also a drawing lesson, although neither she nor Tzvi were artists. Still, she taught me about visual perspective. You don't draw a path like this, she said, drawing 2 parallel lines down the page from top to bottom and adding simple tree trunks with an orb signifying their foliage. She flipped the page over. It's wasteful to use only one side of the page, I learned. No, you draw a path like this, she explained, and drew 2 diagonal lines upwards from the 2 bottom corners of the page so that they bent toward each other and almost met, but stopped just short. Then she added trees, big ones at the bottom of the lines, smaller ones in the middle, and tiny ones near where the lines almost touched. The path looked like it was moving into the page. This is how perspective works. The things closest to you loom large. The things farther away look smaller, even if they're technically all the same size. Why do you think that narrative accounts of trauma are less important than scientific data? My therapist asked me. The reason, I think, is that I doubt my own narrative so deeply that I want empirical science to see me, to convince me I'm allowed to feel as I do, that my experience is legitimate. But science has failed me in many ways, from the years it took to diagnose my genetic condition to my increasing resistance to psychiatric drugs. And so perhaps it's time to trust the narrative. To trust that what my grandparents went through was real, that what my father suffered was real, that the stories I've been told and read and seen about other oppressed people suffering is real. If I believe all that, and I do, then I can admit that my pain is real too, and I can use that to connect with other people who are in pain, so that together we can make a better, less painful world for all of us. Writing, ultimately, is one of the ways that I handle this complexity. Storytelling puts narrative first, and it provides a space to make both tidy and messy connections between what people feel and how they act, between what they believe and what they're scared to admit. Stories are where I allow myself to explore the nuances that can sometimes be so immensely difficult to talk about. Thank you.
Wow. I feel like we should all unmute so you can hear the clapping, because I see some clapping and you need to like experience that. that was super lovely. I'm adding my spotlight so I'm not a mysterious ghost. As I promised, I would love to facilitate some Q&A with you, and I welcome everyone who's been listening alongside me to either use the raising hand function and I'll unmute you, or you can put it in the chat. I did want to start. I'm going to start with a question while people are thinking, because so much of your talk we had discussed would be broader in content, but it's also so woven into your novel. And I want to make that connection and kind of give you the opportunity to speak a little bit about that and your writing process. Um, a few things that I was thinking about was, much of the novel centers around events related to the Shiva for Maggie's mother, Iris, and interactions with family members. And clearly there's this beautiful thread of Jewish content in the novel, but then also clearly other layers. And so could you just talk a little bit about the other layers that are present, and maybe how you approach writing in that way? Or maybe I'm
Yeah,
just
well, so specifically the layers of sort of Judaism that are in the novel, or
oh, I was actually saying you could focus on the layers that are not Jewish,
gotcha.
the other layers, because you have spoken to a lot of the Jewish elements.
Yes. um,
No,
well,
more
there's
Jewish. No.
well, yeah. So, I mean, the novel focuses on a queer woman in her late 20s, right? Which I was when I was writing it. And although it is not directly autobiographical in any way, there are obviously a lot of sort of things that I was thinking about that went into it. And one of the things that I was thinking about a lot was just sort of the conversations that a lot of millennials I know have, and the ways in which we do and do not connect with our parents' generation, the ways in which we conceive of our own queerness, what we lose if we don't connect to former generations, what we lose if we don't connect and talk to queer people who came before us, right? If what we lose if we don't talk to just our peers, right, and sort of listen to what people of different experiences are going through. And so there were a lot of those things that I wanted to sort of bring in many ways, but I wanted to do it through character. Like I didn't want to do it in any pedantic way, because I'm not really interested in pedantic novels, and I don't think they're very interesting, because then they're kind of propaganda, and that's not what I want to write. So I wanted to approach all of these things through characters, and the way that I thought about it was just sort of trying to organically let various people sort of come into the book, right? And it wasn't often like a very deliberate thing of like, oh, here's this identity that this person can be. It was more like, who are people that Iris would be into, or who are people that Maggie would know, and how would they know these people, and thinking about those conversations that they would have, and like where organically these connections could be drawn through story, through character.
It's funny. As you're responding to that, I'm seeing another question in the chat that is perhaps similar in the one I posed, although phrased better. So perhaps it's also different. I'll read it aloud. But how do you weave intersectionality into your writing in a way that seems natural?
That's a good question, and I wish I had like a good answer for it. I think it's about how I try to live to some extent. I mean, and also what I read, right? So I am a voracious reader, and I'm very interested in just sort of engaging with a wide array of novels and stories, and listening to what I learn from those texts, right? So even if there are experiences in various texts that are very different from mine, that doesn't mean that I can't relate to them emotionally. Like I can't relate to the experience itself, right? To the specifics often, but emotionally, I can relate. I can extend myself in that way, right? Mostly because novels, to me, fiction extends itself to me. You know, to me that's the beauty of stories and of fiction, is that it is such an expansive and generous form. Um, and so I guess when I think about any kind of fiction writing, I want to weave in as much of the world as I see it and experience it as possible. And the world that we live in is intersectional, right? I mean, all of us, every human being has a variety of intersecting identities. And there are different things that we experience through those intersections. That the term intersectionality, by the way, I know that I'm using it in the sort of not academic original way that it was meant. I'm using it in the more colloquial term that it has become. So I think that it's really just kind of trying to depict the world that I see around me, and the world that I see around me is a complicated one, with many different people in it. Not just people who look like me, not just people who have the life experience that I have. Um, so yeah, I think it's just that, just trying to sort of understand the world we live in and constantly keep understanding it better as much as I can.
Uh, Wonderful. So I have a couple other, like, hearing you're a voracious reader, I'd love to know what are like the top 3 books off the top of your head in the last year that you've read
Oh
that you want to
gosh.
share.
That's so hard. Well, I'll share my syllabus that I was teaching because and they're not new though. I was teaching a queer literature class, and I taught Passing by Nella Larson, which is a book that came out in 1927. I think it might be 1929. One of her books was 27 and the other was 29. And I taught Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, and Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown, and then a newer book, My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, which is a really cool, excuse the motorcycle outside my window, which is a sort of memoir and biography woven together, about the author, Jen Chaplin, and about Carson McCullers, who is a queer author from the 40s and 50s.
Awesome. And then I was going to ask about favorite podcasts, but then I realized, don't you have a podcast? And then I was going to link that. I just kind of lump it in with a question of, you know, you've lived in Israel, in California. You've been in Nebraska for the past 3 years or more, I think 3-ish years. So how has that experience been for you? And are there any interesting observations you can share?
Sure. I don't have a podcast anymore. I'll just quickly recommend podcasts because there are some really good ones happening right now. I really like You're Wrong About. I also really like Resistance, which is fantastic. It's on Spotify, and it started last summer, and it's spotlights various forms of resistance. Largely Black resistance in this country, but like they did an episode on Nigeria. It's fascinating. It's amazing reporting. And for a movie podcast, if you're into listening to people talk about movies and feelings, I like Why Are Dads? Oh no, it's not called that anymore. It's called You Are Good Now. So those are just some podcasts. Oh, and On the Media. Speaking of mass media misinformation, On the Media is very good at sort of breaking that down. Insights on living in various places. Gosh. Well, I will tell you that I got into my PhD program here in Nebraska when I was living in New York. And it was very soon after the 2016 election. And I had a lot of friends who sort of, when I told them, oh, I'm moving to Nebraska, they said, ew, why? In this very snobby way that I really, even then, thought was like, that's not fair. That's just not fair. And and then I moved here, and I just proved myself right. By which I mean that I learned, I didn't know anything about the Midwest. Like I knew nothing. I was born in LA. I lived there for 3 years when I was a baby. then moved to New York for college and lived there until I moved here. So I really knew nothing about the middle of the country. And I am so glad that I moved here. I'm so glad that I came here to study. I'm so glad that, I got to see Nebraska's huge, beautiful sky, that I got to like drive at midnight from Lincoln to Omaha to pick someone up at the airport. And like, there's that really dark stretch of road. And every time I drive it, I imagine maybe this time I'll see a UFO. Like I've learned to love the way you see the fields change with the seasons. I love Lincoln. The city that I live in is great. I love what I've seen and learned of Omaha. And it's just, yeah, I'm glad that I came here. I'm glad that I got to meet queer people here. I'm glad that I got to teach young students here, that I got to teach 18 and 19-year-olds who, some of whom, I was the first teacher they ever met who was queer or who was openly queer. I might have been the first teacher they had who has tattoos, who has piercings. Like we got to talk about these things, and it's felt amazing. And I'm so glad that I moved here, so that's my biggest insight, is like that when people, excuse my French, shit talk the Midwest who live on the coast, I'm going to shut them down.
Wonderful. Well, I'm mindful of the time. It's almost 8, but we do have another question in the chat that I think would be wonderful to have you answer. How you describe writing characters reminds Karen of things she's seen written by J. Michael Straczynski. I'm not.
I confess to not knowing the author either.
Straczynski, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not a question. I was just reading it. Look at that. I was like in moderator mode. I'm like, that looks like a good question. I'm like, but it's a statement. It's all right.
Wait, never mind. I do know. My
wrote
partner
Babylon
just
5.
Yes, my partner just chimed in the chat to say that. Okay. Cool.
That's hilarious.
Well, thank you, Karen. I appreciate that.
I like wrapping up on time, but I really want to ask you more questions because this is super fun.
Well, we can do one more and scooch over time just a little bit if you want.
Okay, I guess I did want to how do you when you this is you've written one novel, so it's not like
no, I've written one published novel, I confess.
Really?
I've written 7 others that did not get published.
Okay.
Only 4 of those were sent out. No, only 3 of those were sent out to agents. Some of those were like very much for the drawer and never to be seen by anyone alive ever,
Your honesty is just very refreshing. I enjoy hearing that. So, so I guess that leads my question. Like, tell us how that feels. Like, that's a reality of writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you write something and then a lot of times you don't even want to share it with people.
Mm-hmm.
How, do you want to talk a little bit about that to wrap us up and
Sure. Excuse my bird clock. That's the other noise that was just happening. Yeah, I mean, I decided that I was going to be a writer when I grew up, whatever that meant. When I was like 18 and started writing every day, and I wrote a 200,000 word high fantasy novel about people getting recruited to this magic school, and then like they didn't even get to the magic school until the end of that 200,000 words. Like that whole thing was just the build up to them getting there. And then I was like, okay, I can't continue doing that. And then I went and wrote other things, just because like that was just too long, and I couldn't even imagine trying to edit that long of a project. And I kept writing, and I kept writing and I kept writing, and eventually I wrote something that felt like maybe I could send it out to agents, and I did, and they said no. Some of them said no very nicely. And so I was like, okay, I will write another book. And then I did that, and then I sent it out, and they said no. And so I wrote another one, and I sent it out, and they said no. And every time it stung, but it was important enough to me to keep going. And meanwhile, the way that I went about dealing with that was also I started writing in other venues, right? I became a book critic, so that's one of my jobs is being a book critic, and I love it. It's one of my favorite media to write in is criticism, because I think it's very rich and doesn't mean to critique necessarily. It more means to, like, for me at least, to put things in conversation with each other, to put books in conversation with the world that we live in right now is a lot of how I think about it. And so that helped with my ego a little bit, because like I was getting a bit of traction there, so I was sort of like, I was publishing things, I was getting to put things like, here, I published this, and that helped a bit. But mostly it was just sort of, I had to keep going. I couldn't let myself think about what would happen if I didn't manage whatever that meant, to do this, because I didn't want to think about that world. And so I just imagined my way out of that possibility, I guess, by a lot of hard work, and by also learning a lot about the industry was how I went about it, which is not an option that is available to anyone. Like I had all sorts of privileges that allowed me to be able to live in New York. My mom helped pay my rent for the first few months that I was living there after college. I managed to get internships because I had a professor who, like, told me about an internship that I should apply for. Like, I had all of these things that were helping me to get to know the industry. But yeah, but in the end, I sent this book to one of the agents who had very kindly rejected one of my previous books. And he loved it. And so the rest is history, I guess. But I mean, it still doesn't mean it means something. It means a lot to have a book published, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that my next book will get published. Like, that unfortunately happens a lot too. And if that happens, I will just write another one.
Well, wonderful. I hope you do, because I really enjoyed your novel, and I recommend everyone go out and get themselves a copy. If they would prefer to check it out of the Kripke Jewish Federation Library, we have a copy. It's available. It's currently checked out, so you may have to put yourself on the waiting list. But I
And the
just,
local libraries are also always wonderful
oh
places.
yeah,
Yeah.
I, Omaha Public Libraries are super awesome. So
Yes.
I just want to thank you so much for your time this evening, and thank everyone who's joined us. Uh, we're delighted that you'll be teaching this two different cohorts of students in the coming week, and
Looking
then the
forward to it.
following Monday we're going to have this open mic night to have them share some of their work. So I really I'm delighted to continue working with you, and want to thank everyone for being here.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you everyone who took time out of their Wednesday night to be here. It's
Yeah,
appreciated.
wonderful.